We're learning now about who will be appearing at Thursday's primetime House Select Committee hearing investigating the January 6th Capitol riot. Former National Security Council official Matthew Pottinger and White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, both of whom resigned just after the January 6th siege, will field questions from the committee. Meanwhile, the National Archives is asking the Secret Service to investigate what happened to the missing text messages from the week of that Capitol assault. The House committee also issued a subpoena seeking those messages and other related records. For more, let us bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion. Nikole, great to see you. We haven't heard much from Matthews and Pottinger in video snippets in earlier hearings. So what is the committee hoping for now?
Yeah, that's right. Well, we have heard a little bit from him in hearings, mostly talking about that tweet that then President Trump put out in the midst of the riot, saying something to the effect of Mike Pence, referring to the vice president at the time, didn't have the courage to do what should be done. And so, we did hear in tape testimony earlier in this series of hearings, Matt Pottinger tell the committee that kind of in that moment is when he decided to resign. And I did have a chance to talk earlier today with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, who is one of the members of the Select Committee who is leading this panel. And she said that we will hear more from Matthew Pottinger about his decision to resign and why he felt more or less that it ran counter to his values in terms of, what he witnessed that day. We also expect to hear more, as you mentioned, from former Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, who also we've heard in recorded testimony referred to that same tweet, saying that she felt the former president was pouring gasoline on the fire by issuing that tweet about Mike Pence. And so, again, Congresswoman Luria telling me that Sarah Matthews will likely testify more about her role at the White House that day and what she witnessed.
Very good. The National Archives says it wants the Secret Service to investigate these deleted text messages that occurred around the time of this January 6th attack. The Secret Service pledged, quote, full cooperation with this review. First of all, Nikole, does Congress regard that, or the National Archives regard that as a credible response from the Secret Service? And does anyone have an idea what these messages, these text messages, might have been about or what they contained?
Well, I think from the members that we've talked to here on the Hill, both with the Select Committee and just in general with some of the other committees that have been briefed on this, is that they do want to know more information about what exactly happened here. We spoke a short time ago with Select Committee member Jamie Raskin, who said that he's not sure that the committee knows the full extent of, what may have happened with these messages, but that he's hopeful that there is perhaps some type of way or mechanism to retrieve them. But he also told one of our producers that he would be shocked and horrified if the destruction of these messages was overseen by a member of leadership within the Secret Service. So I think there's still a lot that remains to be determined as far as the National Archives is concerned. In its letter to the Department of Homeland Security and Secret Service, it did say that if any messages were improperly deleted, that the Secret Service has 30 calendar days to notify the archives and also needs to provide a report of what happened.
And Nikole, real quick, these text messages could illuminate conversations between members of the Secret Service, either about what then President Trump did or didn't do, and I'm sure that's of interest, to put it mildly, to members of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, all we know in reference to these tweets is that, or text messages, I should say, is that they were from January 5th and January 6th. That is according to the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General, which initially flagged these missing messages. And so, of course, we know that the Secret Service was quite involved, especially on the day of January 6th. What some committee members have told me, for instance, they would like to learn more about, for instance, the Secret Service's role. Obviously, they were protecting the former president. We did hear a lot of that testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson before the panel about, what may have transpired in the presidential limo or the Beast following that rally. So that, we don't know if there are any messages connected or affiliated with that particular story or instance. There were also Secret Service agents who were with former Vice President Mike Pence when he was here in the Capitol. So, look, look, these potentially deleted messages could cover a range of things. At the end of the day, again, the Select Committee simply just wants to get to the bottom of what happened. And again, we do know from the Secret Service that they said that even if these messages in question may have been deleted, again, through some type of factory reset or migration that occurred throughout the agency, that it is exploring all possible avenues to try to get assistance in retrieving them, including trying to contact phone providers.
That could be an avenue. So the Select Committee subpoenaed Steve Bannon. He rejected that or didn't comply. The Justice Department then indicted him on contempt of Congress, and the first day of his trial was today. I'm not asking you to be a theater critic or a legal beagle, but in general, what transpired?
Well, look, this trial has gotten off to a bit of a slow start in the sense that it took the better part of a day and a half to seat a jury. Once that happened, opening arguments did take place earlier today, where both sides pretty much argued again in terms of these charges that Steve Bannon is facing in terms of contempt of Congress. Of course, in terms of the committee's position on this, and prosecutors, they say when Steve Bannon was subpoenaed, that was kind of a date certain, that they expected his cooperation, whereas Bannon's team is arguing, well, look, Bannon's counsel was in conversation with the Select Committee, and so, in their view, it was more something where they felt it was a bit more negotiable. So we did hear, in addition to those opening arguments from both sides, there was a staffer from the House Select Committee who appeared in court today testifying on behalf of the prosecution, but that really seemed to anger Steve Bannon because as he exited the courtroom today, he really blasted the committee for putting forth this staffer, saying he wants to see a member of the Select Committee come before the court, someone like Chairman Benny Thompson, although earlier today we learned that Chairman Thompson has tested positive for coronavirus.
Lots of topics, lots of information. Nikole Killion, as always. Thanks so much.
You bet.